All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for stopping by today. Really excited to have the opportunity to share with you all of the new and exciting changes for MHAA's fiscal year 25 grant round. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started for today. So first off, some quick introductions. My name is Andrew, and I'm one of the assistant administrators here with the Maryland Heritage Areas program. I'm also joined by my colleague Martha.
Thank you for the intel. We appreciate it. All right.
Martha, did you want to say hi?
Yeah, sorry, I got distracted. Hi, everyone. I am Martha Waldron. I am another assistant administrator for the program and somebody who works with about a third of the grantees for the Maryland Heritage Areas program. So nice to see you all.
And although she can't be here today, our program is also working with our administrator, Ariane Hofstede, who will be working as a grant manager as well for some of your projects. So with those introductions out of the way, let's go ahead and jump straight into it. So we have got a packed agenda for today, as you can see. We're going to be covering a lot of different topics, walking you through the process of successfully submitting an application to our program for our project grants. You can see here that we're going to briefly discuss the Maryland Heritage Areas to give you all an introduction to who we are and what we're all about. We're then going to take a look at the types of grants that are available this fiscal year, including assessing eligibility, taking a look at the types of projects that we can fund, and also discussing eligible expenses so we can answer any questions there. Once we've done that, we're going to take a look at the application and award schedule so you can get a sense of the timeline for fiscal year 25. And finally, we're going to wrap up with a handful of tips and guidelines on how to submit your application, as well as how to use our online application system. And before we dive any further, I just want to give a heads up that we will be monitoring the chat both in the call where we're presenting, as well as over on YouTube here. And if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in chat. Towards the end of this presentation, we're going to have an opportunity to sit down, go over those questions, and chat with you about your projects. But for now, go ahead and put them in the chat here, and we will tackle those questions towards the end of the presentation. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and just briefly mention that everything that you're going to be looking at here today is covered in much greater detail in our fiscal year 25 grant guidelines. A link to the guidelines is available in the description of this video on YouTube, as well as we're going to post it in the chat in just a moment here. But as we go through the slides, you're going to see that a lot of the information that's being covered is going to have bright text showing you that there is additional information if you want to dive much deeper into these various topics available in the grant guidelines. So if you have any questions about what you're hearing, I would encourage you to check those guidelines out. You'll be able to get much more information about things like eligibility, matching requirements, and so on. And again, that's going to be conveniently placed right on the slides as we're going through today's presentation. Okay, so let's go ahead and start off by talking about MHAA as a program, who we are, what we're about, and how we work. The best place to start this conversation is going to be talking about heritage areas. So Maryland is one of only a couple states in the country that has a statewide heritage area program. And within our state, we are super lucky to have 13 unique heritage areas that touch every single county and the city of Baltimore. These heritage areas are local state partnerships. They are locally designated and operated, but they are state certified and receive state level support. The best way to think of them is as collections of cultural, historic, and natural resources that tell the tale of a specific part of Maryland's regional identity. And the goal of these heritage areas is to help drive heritage tourism and preserve regional identity to make sure that we can protect these resources and get people excited to come visit the various parts of our state. Now, MHAA has a really well-defined and specific mission, which you can see on the slide here. In essence, our goal is to support the economic well-being of Maryland's communities by preserving cultural, historic, and natural resources through partnerships and by promoting and developing place-based experiences that are for both visitors and residents alike. And again, the main mechanism that we're going to do this through is going to be heritage tourism. So you can see here that every single county, like I mentioned, is covered, or it does have a heritage area. So no matter where your projects are taking place, you're never going to be too far away from a heritage area. The areas all vary in size and scale, but they all capture unique parts of the state. And in a moment, I'm going to go over how you can check if your project falls within a heritage area. Now, you've heard me talk a little bit about heritage tourism, and there's a lot of different definitions floating around as to what heritage tourism is. And heritage tourism really is at the core of our program. So I want to go ahead and start off by setting forward a shared definition so that we can all be on the same page. MHAA tends to use the definition that comes directly from the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And as you can see here, they define heritage tourism as traveling to experience the places and activities that authentically represent the stories and people of the past and present. And that's including historical, cultural, and natural resources. So you've got a little bit of a sense of the goal of our program and how we operate. Let's actually take a look at MHAA as an organization. So you'll hear the acronym thrown around a lot, MHAA. That is the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority. And we are an independent body that is within the Maryland Department of Planning and administered by the Maryland Historical Trust. Now, one thing that I really want to stress, because there is a lot of confusion here, is that our organization is not a part of the Maryland Historical Trust. Even though they have history in their name and we have heritage in ours, even though they sound similar, we are not the same organization. We often partner on a lot of different things, but MHAA is its own organization that operates completely independently of the trust. It's actually governed by a 19-member body, including members of the public and representatives from 9 state agencies, and the program receives around $6 million every single year through Program Open Space. And it's those $6 million that go towards operating the program and also funding the grant opportunities that you're going to be hearing about today. So our program has 3 main goals, and these goals are relevant to today's discussion because they are 3 of the main items that project grants are going to be assessed against. So, to briefly touch on those 3 goals, our first goal is, of course, developing heritage tourism products. And this can look like a lot of different things. This can be everything from your traditional historic restoration of a property that's going to get people excited to come see a historic home, to new and exciting opportunities, like cutting a new trail that's going to allow people to experience Maryland's natural resources. So heritage tourism products are at the center of our work. But the 2 other goals are also really important. We've got building partnerships. So Maryland is incredibly lucky to have a diverse network of all sorts of folks doing incredible work in the historical, cultural, and natural fields. When we're looking at our projects, we really are looking for opportunities to promote partnerships between the people that are already doing this great work. Whether that is helping to connect a local historical society with a museum that's putting together an exhibit, or connect a community foundation with a trail building group that wants to build a new trail. We're looking to help support projects and build those partnerships within communities so that we can bring these folks together. And finally, our last goal, sustaining regional identity. Maryland is a small state for sure, but it really is home to so many unique cultures, whether you're talking about Baltimore City or the DC suburbs or the Eastern Shore or out in Garrett County. There are so many unique cultures and unique cultural heritages and identities that we want to make sure are preserved. So we're always looking for opportunities to help make sure that cultural heritage is preserved for generations to come. Now, like I mentioned at the onset, our program is really unique in that we are a local to state partnership. You can really think of our program as a two-pronged approach. We've got the state level, where MHAA is providing these capital and non-capital grants that you're going to be hearing about today. We also provide funds to the local heritage areas so that they can operate mini grants, and we provide technical assistance to our active grantees and applicants. So that's at the state level, but it's at the local level where this program really shines. So each individual heritage area has a heritage area management entity that is helping out at the local level to administer the mini grants, to assist folks in completing project grant applications, to engage in the ranking of grant applications as they come into the state level, and to do so much more, whether that's providing technical assistance, whether that's getting people excited about heritage tourism, or whether that's building community within their local region. So if you haven't already, I cannot encourage you enough to reach out to your local heritage area director and start building those opportunities, because it's at that local level where this program really shines. So that's enough about our program. Hopefully that gives you a sense of who we are and what we're about. Of course, if you have any questions, you're welcome to leave them here in the chat or on our YouTube video as well. But for now, what I'd like to go ahead and do is talk a little bit about the grant opportunities that are coming available for fiscal year 25. Starting first with the most important question, eligibility. So there are a few key criteria to consider when you're thinking about applying for our program. Number one, our program can only provide grants to nonprofits and government entities, whether that's a local jurisdiction, state entity, or federal agency. Now, if you're a private individual, sadly, our program cannot provide grants to you, but we would encourage you, if you have a brilliant project, to seek out nonprofits that you can partner with so that they can apply to this program. So criteria number one, you have to be a nonprofit or government entity. Criteria number two, the project that you're proposing has to take place within the boundaries of a heritage area. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that over the next few slides here. So, like I mentioned earlier, every county in Maryland has a heritage area, but not the entire state falls within a heritage area. Luckily, there's a really easy way to check whether or not your project is going to fall within the boundaries. You can see here we have a link to MHAA, which is the Maryland Historical Trust's Cultural Resource Information System. This is a great tool, and we have a wonderful tutorial online as to how to use it, but what I'm going to go ahead and do is quickly talk about how you can check if you fall within a heritage area. So once you've navigated to MHAA at the link you just saw, what you're going to want to do is click on the Layers tab, then select Other MHT-based data, and finally you'll want to select Maryland Heritage Areas. Doing that is going to light up the map with this purple shade and show you exactly where the boundaries of each heritage area are, down to the exact parcel. Once you have that layer on, all you need to do is type in the address of where your proposed work is going to take place into the little search bar at the top of the map. That'll drop a pin on the address, and you'll be able to check whether or not it's within or without a boundary. Now, we get a question that comes up quite frequently. What if the project is not in a boundary? And the answer to that is a little bit complicated. The first half of the answer is if your project isn't within a boundary, it's not eligible for a grant this year. But the second half of that answer is that some heritage areas are currently undertaking boundary expansions. So if you have a great project and you find out that it falls outside of a boundary, I would strongly encourage you to reach out to your local heritage area and see if they are one of those heritage areas that is considering a boundary amendment. This doesn't mean that you'll be eligible this year for a grant, but it does give you the opportunity to start that conversation and see if they would be interested in adding your site into their heritage area. These boundary amendments vary in size and scale, and different heritage areas take different approaches to how they expand their boundaries. But it's always worth reaching out to your local heritage area director if you find out you're just outside of a boundary and starting that conversation so that they can begin to plan for how they might want to partner with you in the future. And one more thing I'll add here is just a brief clarification to a question that we get quite frequently. And that is whether or not your organization itself needs to fall within a heritage area. I'm happy to share that as long as the work that you're proposing is within the boundaries of a heritage area, you are absolutely good to go. If your organization, for example, is in DC, but you're proposing work that's going to take place in one of Maryland's state parks that's within a heritage area, you're good to go. So, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at the timeline. The most important date to take away from here is going to be January 26th of next year. That is the day when our intent to applies are due. This really short one-page form is an opportunity to let us know what kind of project you are considering, and it is the only way that you will be eligible to apply for a full grant. What's really important about the ITA is that it is non-binding. So if you put forward this ITA for a certain type of project, and by the time March rolls around you've decided you want to do a different one, that's perfectly fine. But if you don't put forward an ITA by the deadline, you will not be eligible to submit a full application. So again, the most important date here, January 26th of next year, is the deadline for our ITAs. Now, the next most important date is March 4th. That's the deadline for our full applications, including multi-heritage area applications. We are so thrilled this year to be putting forward a single deadline for grants, so this should help to clarify any confusion about when your deadline is falling. So again, all of our grants for every heritage this year is going to be due on March 4th of next year. Now, once that application has been submitted, they are going to be reviewed between April and June of next year by both a state and local review panel. Once the decisions have been made, you'll be hearing back from us in July of next year. And it's going to be that July date when you are able to start your project. But here's the thing. Even though you're able to start your project in July, grant agreements won't be going out until sometime between August and December. And it's going to be important to keep in mind that many grantees don't receive their first payment until the beginning of the subsequent year. Now, some grantees are able to get their payments earlier, but it's useful to keep that deadline in mind just as you're planning your project. So keep in mind that you may not receive your initial payment until January of 2025. So you've got the timeline covered here. Next up, what I'd like to do is just talk about the two types of grants that we have available for this year. Those are our capital and non-capital project grants. So first up, we've got our capital grants. These are our brick and mortar projects. And one thing that I want to stress right off the bat is that even though we call them our brick and mortar projects, they can be so much more than a traditional historic restoration project. We often get a lot of people coming to us thinking that the only types of grants that we can give are ones that are funding the restoration of a historic home. But this program is unique in that it has the opportunity to do so much more than that. Whether that is the acquisition of new land, whether that is laying a parking lot that's going to allow people to access a heritage trail, whether that's building amenities like restrooms or kitchens at a museum or cultural center, we have so much leeway when it comes to approving capital projects. As long as they tie back to that heritage tourism aspect, we are good to go. So the other thing that comes up quite frequently is questions about pre-development. This is, we often hear from folks wondering if they can use capital grants to cover things like architectural documents, design documents, architectural fees, engineering fees. As long as this is working towards a tangible product down the line, that also falls within our capital project grants. So these grants really do have a wide variety. You can really do a lot of different types of work with our capital grants. Whatever type of work you're looking to do, our capital grants are always going to be subject to both Section 106 review and easement review from MHT. So first up, Section 106 review is a simple compliance review to make sure that the project that you're proposing will not negatively impact any historical resource. In addition to that, all capital projects have to go through the easement review process. I'm going to talk a little bit more on the next slide about what that process looks like, but just want to give a heads up that our easement review process usually only applies to, I would say, maybe 5 out of 100 or so grants that we give every year. But if you're working with a highly historic property, let's say one that's on the National Register, there is a possibility that MHT will want to take out an easement on the property. Of course, if you're doing new construction, laying trails, anything like that, that wouldn't be a consideration. Again, want to stress here that the project that you're putting forward does not have to be a historic property. Our program works with all sorts of different capital projects, including the construction of new museums and cultural centers. So just want to really reiterate that there is a lot of freedom here in how you apply these capital projects. And finally, I want to mention that if you are planning on doing a capital project, you will need to acquire property owner consent from whoever owns that property. If that's your own organization, that's great, but if you're planning on doing work from another, on the property that is owned by another individual, you're going to have to make sure that you get permission beforehand as a term of your grant award. Now, the big question, how much money can you apply for? Our capital grants range from $5,000 at the lowest end to $100,000 at the highest end. And all of our grants, capital and otherwise, require a 1-to-1 match of non-state support. So now a little bit more on the easements here. Like I mentioned earlier on, our easements really only apply to projects that are taking place on properties that are eligible for the National Register. So we're only talking about properties that are of the highest historic value. And the goal of the easements here is to make sure that there will be no damage to Maryland's most important historic resources. So, as a condition of your grant, MHAA might require that you convey a term easement if you fall into that category of National Register eligible property. Even if you're on the National Register, there's no guarantee that MHT will require an easement, but every single capital project does go through this layer of easement review to assess whether that easement will be required or not. Now, the length of the easement is determined by the size of your grant award as well as the duration of the grant project. But the minimum term of an easement is 15 years, regardless of the grant amount. So even if you get $5,000, that would be 15 years. And if you acquire additional grants, that would add additional years to your easement. But again, we get a lot of questions about easements. I just want to reassure folks that this really only applies to properties that are of the highest historic importance, properties that are on the National Register, properties that are in danger of being damaged if the wrong type of work is being done. But I think it's helpful to have that in the back of your head that that may be a requirement as you're coming forward for a capital project. So that's our capital grants out of the way. Next up, let's go ahead and briefly talk about non-capital grants. These are everything that isn't a brick and mortar project. Now, most traditionally, this looks like a museum exhibit, but this can also include all sorts of other really exciting work, whether that is planning for work down the line, let's say research that would contribute to an exhibit or a new museum, whether that's a field investigation or archaeological study that is going to prepare a heritage tourism product down the line, or it can also be things like programming. MHAA has historically funded seminars, conferences, performances, even festivals. Again, there has to be a heritage tourism component associated with it, but as long as that heritage tourism is there, we can absolutely fund everything from special events to planning and research, and of course, our traditional museum exhibits, interpretive brochures, educational programming, and so on. Now, our non-capital projects will also go through Section 106 review, but they of course do not come with an easement review, and they range from $5,000 to $50,000, also with a 1-to-1 match requirement. So whether you're applying for capital and non-capital, there are a few things that MHAA grants cannot fund. The first thing that we can't fund is overhead for applicant organizations. That being said, nonprofits that are applying for non-capital grants are eligible to include indirect costs as a part of their budget, up to 10% of their grant funds. But again, in general, our grants cannot provide operating support to organizations. There has to be a tangible product that's being worked towards. To that end, grants funds cannot be spent on staff salaries for the applicant organization. However, those staff salaries make a wonderful, wonderful tool to fulfill the 1-to-1 grant, their 1-to-1 match requirement. In addition, we get a lot of questions regarding where consultant fees fall into that. Luckily, we can provide funding for consultant fees, whether that's engineering fees or consultant fees for design documents. That is absolutely an appropriate expenditure. Another thing that comes up here is that we are not able to spend grant funds on marketing expenditures. So if you're doing any kind of marketing, we cannot pay for that. But just like staff salaries, marketing is a great way to fulfill your 1-to-1 match. So if you are putting together an exhibit and you want to market that exhibit, that marketing can absolutely fulfill that 1-to-1 match. And finally, whether it's in your grant funds or your match, MHAA is prohibited from funding any type of alcohol or liquor. We can, however, fund food, which is a question that comes up quite frequently. So if you're doing an event, we can cover the food, but no alcohol at all. Now, I've talked a lot about the match. Let me just clarify what I'm talking about there. So whether you're doing capital or non-capital grants, you will be required to put forward $1 of your own organization's money for every dollar of state support that you receive. But the great news is that that dollar that you put forward does not need to be cash match. You can do any combination of cash and in-kind match. And I'm going to talk on the next slide a little bit more about what that means. But I do want to note here that if your project is going to exceed the 1-to-1 match requirement, as many projects do, you'll have the opportunity to track that under other project costs. That lets us know how much money is being leveraged by these grants. And finally, just to touch on here, one point of clarification: no matching funds can come from other sources of state funds. So let's say you got a grant from another state agency. Sadly, that grant cannot be used to fulfill your 1-to-1 match requirement. But if you received a grant from a private organization, from a federal agency, or from a local jurisdiction, those funds are completely appropriate. And one final caveat to that statement is that staff time from state employees, even though those are technically state funds, are eligible. And a good example of this would be if you're doing an archaeological dig and you want to partner with one of the University of Maryland archaeology teams, you would be able to use that staff time as part of your match. So again, like I mentioned, your match can be any combination of cash and in-kind. So cash match is exactly what it sounds like, but in-kind is an opportunity for you to be really creative about how you fulfill this 1-to-1 match requirement. And we encourage you to take advantage of the in-kind opportunity whenever possible. So these in-kind matches can include anything from volunteer time to donated goods and services, discounted materials, and the time of your partners and board members that have been spent on the project. The great news is that volunteer time is valued actually quite highly, currently at $34.12 an hour. So that is a wonderful opportunity for you to fulfill that 1-to-1 match requirement with the time that's being already spent on performing this project. And of course, if you have any questions about how you're going to fulfill your matching requirement, please feel comfortable reaching out to us or your local Heritage Area Director to discuss how you can fulfill that requirement.
So Andrew's given all of you a great overview of the program itself, the types of eligible applicants, and of course, the types of project grants that we are able to distribute. I am going to spend a little bit of time focusing on this year's application to give you an idea of what type of information you will be expected to provide and what you should be thinking about when you're brainstorming or forming a project that you'd like to apply for funding for. So very briefly, I'm just going to discuss the different components of the FY25 MHAA application, which are outlined here on this slide. So the first section is pretty standard as far as grant applications go. You'll be required to provide a project summary, an overall project description, give us more context for the project that you're specifically applying for, and a project timeline. You are also required to submit a budget, which I'll talk a little bit about in more detail shortly. But this will include specific line items and supplemental budget documentation to give reviewers an idea of what you'll be spending grant funds on. We also ask about the project's impact. So Andrew gave a great overview of MHAA's program goals earlier in this webinar, and you'll be asked to connect your project to those goals, in addition to aligning your project with the local heritage area's priorities, which again, I'll discuss in more detail shortly. We also ask a question about access and inclusion. How are people going to be accessing your project, and who does it provide access to? And then, of course, an urgency question. Why does this project need to take place now? For those of you who are applying for capital projects, you will also need to provide a little bit of information about the property itself. So you'll need to provide the address. We ask a question about the significance to the community, and if there are any special designations that property holds. And then lastly, as Andrew mentioned, we will ask you to verify that you have the property owner's consent before embarking on this project. So this gives you an idea of how each of those sections are reviewed. Our applications are given a total point value of 100 points. And this shows you how those 100 points are broken down into some of the sections that I just gave a brief description of. So again, that project information section, basic information about your project, 10 points. The budget section with those line items and any budget documentation like quotes or invoices that you may have, also 10 points. You'll see here that the very big bulk of how your application is scored is going to come from that project impact section, which is why I'm going to dive into it a little bit deeper momentarily. So those connections to the program goals, the local heritage area alignment, the accessibility, and the urgency all equal 80 points. So this is really where you want to spend, I would say, the most amount of your time, developing answers that allow the reviewers to really understand how your project connects to each of these components in the project impact section. So Andrew talked about the 3 MHAA goals earlier, increasing heritage tourism products, building partnerships, and sustaining regional identity. And that's really how these 3 project impact questions are also broken up. And so we've provided here a couple bullet points to help you start thinking about how to answer these questions, which can be a little ambiguous, which is on purpose to give you some flexibility. Each of your projects, just like each of your regions and heritage areas, are completely unique. and you have your own identity. And so we want to allow you some flexibility in how you answer this question. So here, we're asking you to talk about how you're going to increase heritage tourism, which again, Andrew gave a wonderful overview earlier in this webinar. We want to know what the product that you're creating or enhancing is going to be. If that product is not tangible within the next year, talk to us about how you're working towards that product. So for example, if your project is really focused on, stabilizing a building now, talk to us about your goals for that building. How do you want tourists and people who live near your property to access that space in the future once the stabilization project has taken place? From there, how are you reaching people with this project? What amenities does it offer to your audiences? Are there restrooms available? Is there interpretive signage for people to read? Are there trails for people to access? Is there a parking lot that people can utilize? We'd love to see any quantitative, but also qualitative information about how you're creating this place-based experience and the numbers of people who you anticipate using it. The next question in the project impact section is, again, that partnerships question. And this is also a little bit ambiguous. We want you to think outside the box here. Partnerships means a lot of different things. And so again, we've put together some bullet points for you to start thinking about how you can answer this question. At the very basic level, we want to know how your project will engage different partners and leverage resources that you might already have. We want to know how your project is bringing people together around a common local vision. So if your project fits nicely into the master plan for your town, for example, and fulfills a town goal that's been previously outlined, I think that that's a great opportunity for you to discuss how your project is working towards a common local vision in this section of the application. And lastly, thinking about how your project partners specifically help you build your organizational capacity. So perhaps you're partnering with a firm who is going to be doing the research and writing text for the exhibition that you're requesting funding for. That partnership, even if they're consultants, is helping you build your organizational capacity. You might not have those resources to do that research yourself. And so we want to hear about that in this section. We've also developed a brief example here for you to think about and to give you some ideas for how to answer this area. And then lastly, I'll just leave it with everybody should feel able to list their local heritage area and their local heritage area staff as a partner. And again, Andrew really has encouraged all of you to reach out to those staff and those directors, and we'll continue to do so throughout the presentation and in our materials. But that is your number one partner that you can use in this section. Even, a discussion of your application should warrant some type of partnership that you can discuss in this area of the application. So lastly, I want to talk about that regional identity question on the application, which again ties back to the third program goal of MHAA. How is your project showcasing your heritage area's distinctive assets? So whether it's archaeological, cultural, historic, natural, there's a wide range here. But how is your project showcasing or elevating or uplifting components of the region in which you live in Maryland? We'd like you to consider how your project aligns with the local heritage area's goals. And this is another great reason to have a conversation with your local heritage area. They'll be able to tell you what they're working on, what their objectives or strategies are, and how your project may fit in with what they're already working on. And then lastly, we encourage you to look at your local heritage area's planning documents. As heritage areas, they're all required to have management plans and 5-year action plans that are continuously updated. So again, this is a great reason to talk to those local heritage area staff. They will be able to help you interpret those plans and figure out how your project relates to the regional identity that's been identified and possibly regional identities that have yet to be discussed. But that's kind of an overview of the project impact section, which again is the bulk of your application. I do just briefly want to mention in the application, of which we have sample blank applications on our website on that guidelines and resources page that you're welcome to access as soon as today, which will give you an idea of what all of the questions on the application are asking. We do ask for some supplemental documentation. And so in a moment, I'll talk about some grant writing tips, but this will give you an idea of some of the materials that you should be working on getting together between now and that March application deadline. So for example, one supplemental document that we do require if you're working on a project that will take place on land owned by the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, you do need to receive DNR approval, whether to continue that project and to show that you have discussed the project with DNR. All of this information is listed in the guidelines, and we have the project approval information application, as well as the person who you're supposed to get in contact with on our website as a resource for you. But this is an FYI for those of you who might be doing projects on DNR land, that this information is required. Additional supplemental documents that we request that may not apply to you, but they may, is pre-K through 12 education project approval for those of you who might be proposing projects that are education focused, in addition to resumes and letters of support from involved parties. Letters of support, I will clarify, are not required, but we do encourage them. They give the reviewers a good idea of who you're working with. It helps support that partnerships section of the application that you've just filled out. And this is a good opportunity to start down that road of requesting those letters before the March deadline. We also ask for organizational documents just to verify your eligibility as a nonprofit specifically. If you're a government agency or a local jurisdiction, you're not required to submit these because you do not have bylaws, for example. And then lastly, one other supplemental document that you might be required to submit, depending on your project, are archaeological, or rather not a supplemental document, but an FYI, is the fact that if you're proposing an archaeological project or archaeological work as a component of your project, it will need to align with MHT's archaeological guidelines. And there's more information about this with a specific link to the archaeological page on MHT's website about those guidelines in our grant guidelines on page 16, outlined here in this little orange starburst. So that's just an FYI, another thing that you may need to consider if archaeology applies to your project. I'm going to just give a brief overview of how your applications are reviewed once you've submitted them, which, yay, you've submitted your application. Now what? Your application is going to be reviewed both at that local heritage area level and at the state level. So we each have our own separate review panels. They will score your application. Those scores are combined to create a ranking chart, at which point there will be discussion about where your application falls on that ranking chart, how much funding is available based on the amount of money requested from all of you wonderful organizations this year. And from there, awards will be recommended to the authority to fund in July of 2024. We encourage you to look back at that FY25 project grants guidelines document that we've been talking about for the last 45 minutes with more information about how your application will be scored. We've also provided a sample scoring sheet to just try to be as transparent as possible. This is the scoring sheet that the grants review panel uses when they review your application. So we are providing you with the rubric that they're looking at, and hopefully it will help you think about how to answer some of these questions, and we'll give you an idea of how they're going to be scored. I'm going to give a few grant writing tips. This has been compiled from past years, past applicants, past grantees, past reviewers, and we hope it's helpful. These are all just considerations and something for you to think about as you're moving through the next couple months of developing your project and fulfilling that intent to apply deadline, and then of course the full application deadline in March. The number one grant writing tip that I'm going to start with is, again, please look through that guidelines document. It's lengthy and it's a little bit robust, but it does have almost all the information you need and will help answer a lot of the questions you have about your application and about the MHAA requirements. Please don't wait to the last minute. We want you to be successful. We love funding these amazing projects every year, and the applications do take a bit of time to put together. So please give yourself time to gather those supplemental materials like estimates, for example, that will help bolster your budget section, any approval letters from DNR, for example, or anything that will just help supplement your application and help it be as successful as possible. Again, if you have any questions or if you're unsure of something, please contact either your local Heritage Area Director or MHAA staff. So that's myself, Andrew, and our colleague Ariane. Our job is literally to assist you with this process. And again, we want you to be successful. So please be in touch. We're more than happy to discuss things with you. Before you start writing, there are a couple of helpful bullet points on this slide for you to ask yourself and your organization. And this will kind of help get the gears turning and help you develop that application. So why are you doing the project? This is a good question that you should have an answer to. Again, what's the timeline? Do you have flexibility in that timeline, especially if you don't receive the grant funds for 6 months after you've been awarded, as Andrew described as a possibility? How does this project fit into your organization's big picture or your organizational goals? What are the steps you need to fulfill the project? Who's going to be fulfilling the project? And then, of course, what is the desired outcome? All of these are important kind of basic questions that will help you form most of the sections in the application itself. If you can answer these, that's great. We also encourage you to have a clear and detailed budget and a project description. The reviewers who are reading your application might not know much about your organization. And so this is an opportunity for you to be clear and concise and really give them a snapshot of what you're hoping to do. With that being said, before you submit your application, it's a good idea to have someone unfamiliar with the project read it and give you feedback. They might, you might reference something in your application that they've never heard of. And it would be helpful for you to, insert a descriptive sentence about what that is or what that means. We also encourage you to give your project a unique and descriptive name, especially for folks who are previous grantees. This really helps distinguish your application this year from past applications or past funded projects, and is something that we suggest. Again, provide as much detail as is requested, and really read through the questions that you're being asked. And then lastly, make sure your matching funds are in hand or committed if possible. This is not a requirement. You are not required to have your match fully identified and in your bank account, for example, before being awarded an MHAA grant, but it does help. The reviewers will be curious about where your match is coming from, and there is a section in the budget template for you to list where your match is coming from if you know it. Again, it's not required, but the more information about certain things, the better. That's just a tip. This is an example of how to kind of align components of your application so that they make sense together and so reviewers can really understand what your project is about. So we really encourage you to align your project description, your timeline, and your budget so that your project is clear. So here's an example. This top box is the description of the project, and we've highlighted or we've bolded and underlined specific words throughout the project description, the timeline in the lower left, and the budget line items in the lower right, so that you can see how each of those project components are incorporated throughout the project itself. So the description talks about a new exhibit, consultants will be hired, they're going to be doing the design, fabrication, and printing brochures. And so those kind of buzzwords are also listed in the timeline. We can see when they're planning to hire the consultant, when the brochures will be finalized, for example, and when the brochure will be printed. Looking then at the budget, those are also some of the line items identified in the project budget. So this is a simple example that will hopefully get you thinking about how to organize some of these pieces and really gives the reviewers a clear idea of what your project is going to be about and what you're going to be using the money for. Once again, start process of collecting this stuff early. The earlier the better. It will just be less stress for you as March approaches. We encourage you to provide visuals where appropriate. If you are talking about a plot of land or an exhibition space, any maps or photographs that you could provide would be great, I think, for the reviewers to understand, again, what your project is about. If something needs maintenance, give us examples of how it's going to be maintained. That's information that the reviewers will probably want to know. And then, of course, follow the instructions for all the online forms that are outlined in the guidelines. And Andrew's going to give an overview. If you're not familiar with our grant system, our grant portal system, after our webinar, they'll give a brief kind of tutorial of how to use our grant system. But remember to fill in all the required fields, and then please save and back up your work often. We'd hate for you to work so hard to put this together and then lose it because something didn't save correctly. So just a few more tips. Moving on with even more tips. Again, some advice from reviewers include clearly defining what your heritage tourism project and or product is going to be. So again, remember that heritage tourism piece kind of weaves through all of this. How are people going to utilize the product or the project that you're proposing? How will it bring people to your heritage area or to your site? Some reviewers really encourage you to make a strong elevator pitch in that project summary area because only a portion of the reviewers are assigned to each application. So you'll probably have between 4 to 6 readers, and that's just a small percentage of the people who actually sit on the panel. So you want to make sure that people know, you come away from reading your application with a good idea of your intentions. Your application should be legible and readable by people from a variety of professional backgrounds. If you have an archaeology project, it'd be useful to write it so that a non-archaeologist could understand what your goals and intentions are, because it's likely that that all the people reading and scoring your application will not be archaeologists. Answer the questions on the application. Don't just write down what you think reviewers will want to hear. And again, this is a great reason to talk to your local heritage area directors. They will help you figure out how to answer the questions on the application. And then lastly, this is an important point. Many projects that come to us are phased projects or part of a bigger plan. And as Andrew described earlier about, a planning or a documentation project, we want to know what your end goal is. So even if, the design documents that you're producing with this grant aren't going to bring visitors in the door next month, we want to know when visitors will come in the door. Give us your ideal scenario and talk to us about how those planning documents are going to help you develop a product eventually and directly. Projects from underserved applicants addressing diverse and inclusive narratives or undertold narratives are encouraged. And we also want everybody to realize that we very much understand that applications are not all going to be written by professional grant writers. That is unrealistic and something that is difficult to achieve. And so our reviewers are trained to look very closely at the content of your application and the content of the project that you're proposing, rather than the length of your answers or how eloquently it's written. So just keep this in mind. We're aware that many of our applicants are written by volunteers who may not have professional grant writing experience. And we want you to know that your applications are seen and are scored just as, on the same level as those that might come from professional grant writers. So please keep that in mind. We try very hard to instill that in the folks who are reviewing and scoring your applications. All right, so now that you have all this in your heads, I'm going to just briefly talk about some action items that you should start to prioritize really as soon as you can, without causing huge amounts of stress. So that first piece that Andrew hopefully really instilled in you all is to submit your intent to apply by midnight on Friday, January 26th. This is the first and foremost important step to making sure that you can submit a full application to the MHAA program. We also encourage you, once again, to read those guidelines for applicants and use the checklist that's in one of the appendices of that guidelines to make sure that you're including all the important pieces. Another action item, once again, talk to your local heritage area staff about how your project aligns with their goals. Discuss your project with legislators and partners, if applicable, for letters of support, which again are not required but can help bolster your application. If you're not the property owner for the land or the location in which your project is taking place, notify the owner of that property that a letter of consent will need to be provided if you receive a grant award. So give them a heads up. If your project is taking place on DNR land or is an education-focused project, again, get those approval letters. And then, of course, start thinking about your budget. So after you submit your intent to apply, really start honing in on what those line items are going to be and start to get some estimates. We ask for a supplemental budget information, and this is where those estimates and the legwork that you've done really can help your project and can give the reviewers an idea of where you're going to be spending those funds. That estimate doesn't need to be, dollar for dollar what you end up spending if you receive a grant. But we want to know that you have an idea of what things cost because the reviewers will want to know. All right, so I'm going to touch briefly on this intent to apply, which again is the most important step and the first step that you should really think about completing for your MHAA application. It is a required first step for every application. So if it's a capital grant, a non-capital grant, everybody needs to submit an intent to apply form. This allows us to get an idea of what you're going to be proposing, but really it gives us an opportunity to check to make sure that your project and your organization are eligible applicants. And it starts a conversation between you and your local heritage area about the project that you're going to be applying for later in March. So to start the intent to apply, you are going to click the intent to apply link on the MHAA website. And you will find that at the shortened link here on this slide. And once you click on that intent to apply form, it will take you to the review port or to the application portal, which Andrew will talk a little bit about in more detail momentarily. From there, you'll log in to the portal, and you'll be asked to submit a brief eligibility quiz. Again, this is very brief. It is asking you to select the heritage area in which your project is located. If you don't know, there's an option to click Don't Know. There's also a link to Medusa, which Andrew gave an overview of if you do want to find out. And there's also a link to that tutorial video that they mentioned as well. But if you don't have time or you're flustered or you're not sure quite how to check, you can select Don't Know, and we'll work with you to determine where your project is taking place. So we ask you to select the heritage area. We also will ask you to select what type of organization you are, whether that's a nonprofit or a local jurisdiction or a government entity. And from there, you will be directed to the intent to apply form, which will look something like this. We do have a blank form on our website that you're able to download and take a look at between now and January 26th if you want to print something out and discuss it with folks you work with or with your board or whomever. Those blank applications and the blank intent to apply are available for you to see. So definitely take a look at those. You will submit your ITA by January 26th as required. And again, we want to remind you that nothing that you put in your ITA is set in stone. We're not going to hold you to anything in there. We know that things change. Things will certainly change between January and March if you're discussing your project with your local heritage area, which we recommend. They might have some great ideas for you. And so your project might take a slightly different direction. So please keep that in mind. We're not holding you to anything in the ITA. We also recommend that you print a copy of your ITA for your records. It's just kind of good documentation management and grant management for you to have that on file. If you've already started an ITA, we really encourage you not to continuously click that ITA link that I showed you in a previous slide. But if you've started an ITA and you've already clicked that link once and you've logged into your portal, we're going to ask you to continue logging into your portal to access that form that you've already started. So you're welcome to start a form today if you'd like, save it, and come back to it anytime between now and January 26th. And the best way to do that is by accessing the grant portal on the Maryland Historical Trust website. It's going to be a big blue button on the left-hand side of your screen. This will take you to the login page. And once you log in, you'll see your ITA as an in-progress application, and you can pick it up right where you left off. After you review the information that you've put in your ITA, again, print and save a copy for your records and review it for errors. A small, strange component of our system is that you need to review it before you can submit it. So basically, you'll kind of have two submission buttons, if you will. Once you've double-checked everything, you will review it by clicking the review button at the bottom. It will basically take you to the exact same page that you just saw of your ITA, but the submit button will now be available at the bottom. So then you'll submit your application or your intent to apply form rather, and you'll see a confirmation at the top of the page, which will look something like this. It will tell you that we received your submission. You will also receive an email with a copy of your submission, which is a great place to make sure that you save or print that copy. And this confirmation message will basically tell you that we received your ITA. It's been shared with your local heritage area, and they will hopefully be in touch with you directly to discuss your project. After you submit an ITA, you will likely receive feedback from your local heritage area. So again, they will be in touch with you to discuss or to clarify any questions that they might have about the ITA you've submitted. And then between then and early March 4th to be exact, you should be working on completing the full application and submitting it by that March 4th deadline. After you submit your March 4th deadline, some heritage areas may provide additional feedback on the application that you've put forward. and allow you to make a few edits. But that's a conversation that you'll have at the local level. And it's also possible that once your application is passed on to the reviewers at the state level, that there might be some clarifying questions from reviewers, at which point Andrew or myself or our colleague Ariane would be in touch with you to get some of those answers. So there is a chance here for a little bit of dialogue facilitated by MHAA staff. A reviewer might want some clarifying information about your budget, for example, or might request photographs of something referenced in your application. And so we may reach out to you to get that information so that they can better score your application. If you don't hear from us, not to worry. It means that we have everything that we need. And then you probably will not hear from MHAA until July, when those awards are announced. And then just lastly, before we kind of wrap up this section of our webinar, it is useful, and we frequently get asked about the funding availability of the program from year to year. As Andrew mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, the program receives $6 million from Program Open Space at this current moment and for the past several years. And that $6 million goes towards operating the program, and about $5.1 million goes towards grants. So there's some operating money in that larger pot. And then from there, the rest is really given out to grantees each year. For project grants, we see an average of 200 grant applications each year. So this is a popular and a much needed program. And I think that that is reflected in the amount of applications we receive. Which means that unfortunately, we're really only able to fund approximately 50% of the applications we receive. But I do think it's important for you all to know that up front. And hopefully it encourages you to write a really stellar application. I also just want to let you all know that the grants review panel can choose to award partial funding depending on how many funds are available and just based on the project that you put forward. All right. So with that being said, between now and the March 4th deadline, we are offering a handful of in-person and virtual Q&A sessions or information sessions to really help you think through your application, answer any other questions you might have that were not answered in either this webinar or in the guidelines that are available to you. And so we hope to see you there. In-person sessions, we'll be conducting two, one in the passages of the Western Potomac Heritage Area up in Allegheny County in early January, and another in the Baltimore National Heritage Area a week later. You don't have to be located in these two heritage areas to attend. If it's a reasonable drive, we'd love to see you, even if you're located in one of the other 11 heritage areas. Please come meet us in person. And then, of course, we'll have a handful of virtual sessions as well if those in-person opportunities just don't work for you. So we'll be hosting a couple of hour-long sessions, which again are really focused on answering questions that you might have about technical components of the application or about your project. For those virtual calls, visit our website to get the specific link to join. And then I do just want to mention a couple of other funding opportunities. You know, there's never enough funding, especially for the types of projects and the types of organizations that apply to this program. And we wish there were unlimited funds to divvy out to all of you who are doing just such wonderful work across the state, but unfortunately, that's just not our reality. But we do encourage you to take a look at some of these other places and take a look at what other funding opportunities might be available to you. And one is, our partners at Maryland Historical Trust. They operate a number of grant programs, and so we encourage you to take a look at what those are. There's the African American Heritage Preservation Program, the Certified Local Governments Program, and then they also run a historic preservation non-capital and capital grant program, respectively. Operating support is always a hot and much needed topic, especially for nonprofits. I'm working on great projects around the state, and so we've listed two operating support sources that we're aware of that we encourage you to look at and figure out, when their grant rounds open. One is with Maryland Humanities. The other is if you are located in an A&E district, to check out the Maryland State Arts Council. Both of these great organizations offer some operating support relief for eligible projects. And then lastly, we encourage you to look at your county and city where you're located to see if they offer any grants. The two listed here are just examples of what could be available. If any of you are located in Anne Arundel or Annapolis, Anne Arundel County or Annapolis, definitely check these specific ones out. But if you're not, take a look at what might be available locally for you. You might be surprised about some of the programs that are closer than you think. So I'm just going to end this portion of our webinar with really trying to encourage you all to be in touch with us. If you have questions, we are available by email, by phone. We hope that the resources on the MHAA webpage are useful to you. If not, tell us so that we can improve them. And I am going to turn it over to Andrew. They're going to walk through some of the online grant application system basics. If you know about the portal that we use, if you use it frequently, this could be a good time to say goodbye and get on with the rest of your day. But of course, you are welcome to stick around. And I will turn it over to Andrew.
Howdy, everyone. So just wanted to note that we don't have any questions in the chat just yet, but if you do have any questions that come up, please feel free to post them in the chat either on the call or on YouTube, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. So let's go ahead and jump into an introduction to our online grant software, just to help folks that are new to our software understand how the program works. So the first step in accessing our grant software is going to be going to the link that you saw earlier and creating an account. Now there are a few things to keep in mind when you're making an account, but the biggest one is that every organization is only able to have a single account associated with them. So if your organization has got a grants manager and a president and a vice president, we can only have one account associated with that organization and by extension, that grant. So make sure that when you're setting up your account, you're considering who is going to be responsible for doing things like submitting the application and filling out any mid and final project reports. That being said, we are able to transfer accounts between email addresses at any time. So if you are working with one individual who is accessing the account and that individual leaves your organization, we do have the ability to transfer it over. We just can't have multiple accounts associated with a single grant record. So, with that out of the way, this is what you're going to be greeted with the first time that you try and log into the MHT Grants page. You can see here at the bottom of this screen, there is a section that says New Applicant. Click here to create a new account. If you don't have a login already, that's where you're going to want to click. That's going to bring you to this page here, which is going to ask you to provide an email address and your own password. Once you've done that, you'll have temporary access to the account, and you'll receive an email confirming the account has been created. So that's how you are going to be creating your account. Let's go ahead and take a look at some tips for actually navigating around the portal, in particularly in accessing your application. So first of all, when you're looking at your application, you're going to see a number of fields are marked with a red asterisk as shown in the top left. Those are marking to let you know that those fields are required on the application. So you wouldn't be able to submit the application without putting at least something in those fields. You'll also see a little bit of a check mark symbol next to a handful of fields. If your browser doesn't provide spell check on its own, those fields, you can click on the spell check to apply spell check to those fields. Some fields also come with word limits. Those word limits are going to be listed next to the text box. If you don't see a word limit listed, there's no word limit associated with the field. Now, on the top of the application, as you'll see in a couple slides, there are various tabs that you can navigate between. You can think of these as various pages of the application. So things that we've already mentioned before, like your property information, your organizational information, and your project information. You can navigate between those pages at any time by clicking on the tabs at the top of the page. So you don't necessarily need to fill out the application in the order that it's laid out for you. Now, the last two notes here are definitely the most important. Number one is that the application only saves itself when you hit the save button. And to have an excess of caution, I strongly recommend that folks hit save before they navigate in between pages. We've had horror stories of people filling out an entire page, then navigating to another page, their internet cuts out for a second, and all of that work that they've done disappears. And sadly, there's not a lot that we can do on our end to get it back. So to avoid that from happening, please strongly encourage you to save frequently. Whenever you remember to, you want to make sure that you're saving. And in addition to that, one of the best ways to avoid having tragedy with saving is to type your answers in a Word document first, and then just copy and paste them into the web browser when you've completed the application. This makes sure that if anything weird happens with the technology, you're not going to be losing any of the responses that you've worked hard to put together. So those are our 6 big tips. Let's go ahead and take an actual look at the form. Yes, but first, just a quick reminder again on saving often. Our system does have a security-based timeout associated with it. So if you do remain inactive for 45 minutes, it will automatically log you out. And perhaps frustratingly, that 45 minutes includes any time that you are typing. So as long as you're not navigating between pages, that timer is counting down. Which means, again, you want to be saving frequently. And again, that's just another great reason to make sure that you are typing your responses in a Word document rather than entering them directly into our field. Now, if you see this warning pop up on the left-hand side, you're welcome to just hit the continue button, and that will reset your timer. But of course, if you miss the timeline, if you miss your opportunity to do so, you'll see the warning on the right-hand side, and it will log you out. So again, cannot recommend enough the importance of typing your answers in a separate document, and then just pasting them in when you're done. Now, Martha spoke to this a little bit previously, but one of the real points of confusion that folks have is accessing an application that they have already started. Whether that is going to be your ITA, your full application, or even any of the mid and final project reports that you would have to do as a part of the grant, you're always going to go to the same place to access something that is in progress. And you want to make sure that you're following this avenue rather than, for example, clicking on the Start a New Application link. It'll look like you've lost everything, when in reality, everything is still saved in your grants portal. You can see on the left-hand side, or rather on the right-hand side, there's a little circle around the My Grant Account button. Whenever you want to access an in-progress form, that's where you're going to want to go. And when you log in, you'll want to make sure you're using the same email address and password that you used to create your grant. We've had cases where folks think that everything is gone because they set up a new account under a new email address, and even if it's an email address from the same organization, you won't be able to access all of those grants that you've submitted under a different email address. So we've already talked a little bit about what it looks like to submit your ITA, but once you've got your ITA in, that's going to unlock your full application. And you'll be able to start working on that as you wait for feedback from your local heritage area. We definitely encourage you to wait for that feedback though, because there's a good chance that your heritage area will have some really useful ideas as to how to strengthen your application. You can access your full application by, again, going to the My Grant account on the MHT website, and I believe on the next slide here, it's going to show you what that's going to look like. Yep, perfect. So you can see here at the top of the page, once you've logged in, there's going to be a little section that says New, and it says to begin the second stage of your application, you'll want to click the link below. So once you've submitted your ITA and it's been approved, you will then see this pop up, and that will allow you to access your capital or non-capital full application. And like I mentioned earlier, there are a variety of pages that are at the top of the application. You can see here we've got introduction, overview, and so on. It's those pages that you can use to navigate around, take a look at all the questions that you're being asked before you want to actually dive into answering them. So this lets you navigate between pages. You can also see at the bottom there is an opportunity to save and finish later, as well as a next button that will allow you to continue on to the next page if you just want to go in chronological order through the document. Now, one of the most frustrating parts of our grant software, something that we are constantly trying to improve, but haven't been able to make huge adjustments to yet, is uploading attachments. It's something that we often run into challenges with, so I just wanted to briefly touch on it here. We have a very fussy system that allows us to upload documents, so your first step, if you want to do that, is going to be first clicking the Choose File button. Then that's going to open up a menu on your computer where you'll want to select the file that you want to upload. Once you have selected that document, you'll want to click the Open button, and that's going to, on the grant portal, bring up the Upload button, which you'll want to click. Additionally, you'll want to add a title in the little section above File Name to help us understand what the document is that you're adding. Another thing that I'll add is that there are a few sections throughout the full application that ask you to upload documents. For example, in the Budget Information section, we ask for any supporting documents, things like quotes or estimates. Within the application, you're only able to upload one document at a time. So let's say you have two separate estimates. You can upload one of them under the Budget Information tab. But if you'd like to upload all of them at once, we ask that you go to the end of the application under Attachments and upload them all there. Now, like Martha mentioned earlier, when you are wrapping up your application, you won't be able to submit until you've clicked on the Review button. And the Review button comes up after you've completed the attachments. The final page is going to be Review My Application. So when you click the Review button, you may see a pop-up like the one that's shown below. This pop-up lets you know what issues the system has automatically found with your application. In particular, it's really looking for any required fields that haven't been filled in, as well as any missing uploaded required documents, such as a budget. So you'll want to go through, once you've reviewed your application, and correct any of these errors before you're able to submit your full application. And of course, if you're running into any issues correcting those errors, please feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be more than happy to help you. So again, you won't be able to see that Submit button until the review process has been completed. One thing to note, though, is that even though not every field is required, we certainly strongly recommend that you fill in every field that's relevant to your application, the more information that you can provide our grant review panelists, the more likely it is that your project is going to be funded. Once you have submitted your application, you're going to receive a confirmation email that's going to contain a copy of your application. Of course, if you have any questions as to whether or not your application has been received, please feel free to reach out to us and we'll be happy to confirm as well that we've got your application in place. The final thing I'll note is that once you have submitted your full application, you may not be able to make changes to the application depending on the heritage area that you applied in. Certain heritage areas provide feedback to their grantees, or rather to their applicants, and allow them the opportunity to make changes, whereas other heritage areas do not. So make sure when you're getting ready to submit that you are 100% happy with all of your answers. So that's just our quick rundown on how to operate our grant system. Again, if you have any questions about operating the grant system or just your project in general, please feel free to reach out. Looking at both of our chats here, it doesn't look like any questions have been posted yet. So for now, I'll say thank you to everyone who joined us live. And if you're watching the video, please feel free to reach out to us if you'd like to connect. Otherwise, we're going to sit around for a few minutes here and answer any questions that may come up. But thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to hearing about the great projects you're going to put forward this year.
I'll also mention that a copy of these slides and a link to the recording of this webinar will be available on the MHAA web pages, specifically that guidelines and resources page that we've highlighted, and we encourage you to look back at them with frequency.
All right, seeing no questions, we'll say thanks a lot. Hope you have a good one.
Bye.